All right, let's dive into something really fascinating today. We're going to break down a geopolitical strategy, one that's allegedly aimed not just at Iran's nuclear program, but at the very fabric of the Iranian state itself. And believe it or not, this whole thing kicks off with a mystery.
So picture this. American B-2 bombers hit Iran's nuclear sites, but afterward, a huge problem surfaced. About 400 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium just vanished. Now getting that up to 90%, which is weapons grade, it's a pretty straightforward process. And that amount, that's enough material for 9 nuclear bombs. A huge deal.
So as long as that stockpile is out there somewhere, well, the job's not done. And that raises a massive question, right? What do you do when your main target literally disappears? You can't just pack up and go home. You have to pivot. And that pivot leads to a new strategy, one that's way more complex.
Okay, so to really get our heads around this, we're going to look at it in 4 stages. First, we'll talk about the unfinished war. Then we'll get into fracturing the periphery, followed by targeting the nerve center, and we'll wrap up with a really interesting twist, an unintended consequence.
All right, so with that nuclear material gone, the whole game changes. The strategy couldn't just be about destruction anymore. It had to shift to disruption. The new goal? To take apart the entire system, the very apparatus that's protecting that missing uranium. And that brings us to the first major piece of this new strategy, fracturing the periphery. You know, suddenly strikes started hitting targets that had nothing to do with nuclear sites. They started focusing on Iran's ethnic fault lines, basically the regions where the country's national unity is the most fragile. Yeah, to really get this, you have to realize that Iran isn't just one big, uniform country. It's not a monolith. Ethnic Persians, they only make up about 60% of the population. The rest is this incredible patchwork of Azerbaijanis, Kurds, Arabs, and others. And here's the key. Most of these groups live along the country's outer edges, its periphery, where the rugged mountains and terrain have always made it harder for the central government to keep a tight grip.
And look, these tensions are nothing new. We're talking about a long history here. That geographic isolation we just mentioned, it allowed all these distinct cultures to form, and they've always pushed back against being assimilated. So when Tehran started centralizing power back in the 20th century, it really stripped away a lot of their regional freedom. This has been fueling calls for more autonomy for decades. It's been simmering forever, and it's even boiled over during major events like the 1979 revolution.
So pretty quickly, a really clear pattern started to emerge. You see strikes systematically hitting 3 specific ethnic regions. In the Kurdish areas, the targets were local command posts. Down in Arab-majority Khuzestan, they were hitting military staging points. And up in the Azerbaijani provinces, it was military assets. Now think about that. These targets don't really pose a threat to an outside enemy, but they are absolutely crucial for Tehran to maintain control over its own people in those regions.
Okay, and a quick but really important note here. We're breaking down an analysis of a geopolitical strategy. This isn't an endorsement of it. We're just looking at the source material and explaining how some strategists seem to be interpreting the moves on the chessboard. So while all this is happening on the outer edges, while the periphery is getting hammered, there's another campaign reportedly going on, a much quieter, more surgical one. And this one was aimed right at the heart of Iranian power, its internal architecture.
So you can really think of this as a 2-pronged strategy. First, you fracture the periphery. You weaken the state's control from the outside in. And at the same time, you decapitate the center. You destabilize it from the inside out. And you do that by going after the leadership of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC.
Now, the IRGC, it's not your typical army, not even close. It's basically a parallel state within a state. It answers only to the supreme leader, it runs huge businesses, controls the media, and, this is key, it oversees Iran's most sensitive programs, like their missile and nuclear efforts. To put it simply, the IRGC is the nerve center of the entire Iranian state.
And this is where it all comes full circle, right back to where we started. The IRGC is the one institution most likely holding on to that missing uranium, so the logic suddenly becomes crystal clear. If you can't find the stuff to destroy it, you do the next best thing, you dismantle the organization that's protecting it. And that's exactly why the IRGC became target number 1. Over a very short span of time, a whole string of their senior commanders were taken out in what analysts called surgical decapitations. These weren't random pot shots, no way. These were incredibly precise hits designed to take out key leaders, throw the chain of command into chaos, and just make that whole architecture of power start to wobble. But
And this is where the whole analysis takes a really sharp and paradoxical turn. There's a growing body of evidence that suggests this whole carefully laid out strategy might actually be backfiring, that it's creating a powerful and completely unintended consequence.
You have to put yourself in the shoes of an average Iranian. They are basically caught between a rock and a hard place. On one side, you've got decades of built-up anger and resentment towards their own repressive government. But on the other side, there's an even greater fear. A fear of total, chaotic state collapse. Why? Because they've all seen what happened next door in Iraq, in Syria, and in Libya. They know better than anyone that foreign intervention can lead to a vacuum of power, violence, and instability.
So what happens? What's the result? A classic rally around the flag effect. The external attacks are basically taking all that internal anger and redirecting it outward. Suddenly, there's a common enemy, an outside threat that feels existential. And that can unite a population that was just moments before deeply divided.
There's a quote from the source material that just nails this irony perfectly. It says, ironically, by bombing Iran, Israel may have inadvertently helped strengthen Tehran's federal authority. In attacking the state, it has legitimized it. Think about that. The very thing that was meant to fracture the state is instead forging a new sense of nationalist resolve.
And so that leaves us with this one big, provocative question that's at the heart of this entire strategy. Can a state actually be broken from the outside, or does the very attempt to break it apart only end up making it stronger in the end?